Welcome to Looking at Lyme, an educational podcast of the Canadian Lyme Disease Foundation, designed to increase awareness, empower listeners with expert knowledge, and explore solutions. I'm Kim Cairns. In this podcast, we talk with Nicole Bell, CEO of Galaxy Diagnostics and author of the memoir, What Lurks in the Woods. Nicole is an experienced executive in the medical device and diagnostics industry and holds master's degrees in materials science and biomedical engineering. Nicole's best-selling and award-winning memoir, What Lurks in the Woods, vividly details her family's experience with undiagnosed tick-borne infection. This firsthand knowledge of the devastating impact of misdiagnosed chronic illness fuels her passion to drive a new diagnostic standard of care for the industry. After losing her husband to tick-borne illness, Nicole set out to use her engineering skills and experience to ensure that no family would have to go through something similar. Nicole also served as the primary author of the State of Lyme Disease Research in the United States and regularly collaborates with the Center for Lyme Action to change the political landscape for Lyme disease and related co-infections. Welcome, Nicole.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
Writing a book about such a profound personal loss must have been incredibly challenging. What motivated you to share your story, and what did you hope to achieve by putting your experiences into words?
Yeah, so my start of writing was actually more out of necessity, honestly. So, I'm an engineer and a scientist by training, and part of the way that I've been successful in my career is I tend to ruminate on problems, right? They spin in my head over and over again, and I eventually figure out a solution.
Right.
But when I was dealing with my husband's illness, which at the time I started writing, all I knew was that it was early onset Alzheimer's disease. The ruminating didn't help. All it was doing was really just making me crazy. And I felt like I needed an outlet to get it out because I just kept having these loops that weren't progressing. And so one morning, actually, it was the night after I had a difficult discussion with my young children because my son kind of realized that something was wrong with dad and he thought it was his fault. And so I had to explain to him that dad was sick and what was going on. And it was just a very weighty conversation. And the next morning I showed up at work. I'm a startup executive. I work in high-tech environments, and I'm usually pretty good at blocking off different things, but I couldn't stop the ruminating cycles. And so I just sat in my office and I wrote what had happened the night before. And that actually ended up being pretty much as written the first chapter of my book. But it didn't intend to be a book at first. It was really just journaling to get those ruminating loops, to give them an outlet. And I found it was really helpful for me to do that. And then fast forward a few months later, and I finally figured out that my husband's Alzheimer's disease was actually caused by tick-borne illness. And that was when it kind of crystallized in my head that, okay, I want to share my story. And at the time I kind of came with that thought. It was, we're going to heal him. He's going to get better. And I'm going to share my story so that other people understand the gravity of these diseases and how complicated they are, and that it's not just a rash and a fever. And people really need to know. So that was when I first thought that I would write a book. Now, unfortunately, my husband's story doesn't end well. He was in the late stages of cognitive decline and his treatment wasn't effective. So our ending is not a victorious one. He ended up passing away in January of 2022. But if anything, that just crystallized my resolve to share the story and to let people know that it's literally can be a life or death situation. And I wanted people to understand, and I wanted it to be very open and honest and raw, because tick-borne illness is messy, right?
Yes.
And I think people need to understand that, and they need to understand the implications and the difficulty that patients and caregivers and families are going through, not only navigating the illness, but also just the uncertainty that surrounds the, Lyme disease and the medical issues and the gaslighting that you get from physicians and so forth. And so I ended up turning it into a book, and my journal entries that I started again out of necessity ended up being invaluable because it captured all of the very raw emotions in the time. And so it made it a process that was healing to go through those, to relive them, and to kind of process the chaos that I had lived through.
I've just got to comment that what a wonderful story it is.
Thank you.
What a necessary piece of information for people that are going through something they don't understand. Their doctors don't understand it, and they're not getting many answers. So I think that process of entering your journal entries and creating a book out of this helps people through the process of the unknown.
And I'm a huge fan of journaling. I recommend it to anybody who's going through any journey, but particularly a medical journey where you're trying to figure out symptoms and tracking, is this helping? Is this not helping? I found it an invaluable tool for being a good caregiver and also for my healing process.
Mm-hmm. How did it help you with your children regarding their grief process by having that aspect to it?
Well, they haven't read the book yet. My son says he doesn't want to read it because he lived it, so he doesn't really need to know. He may change as he gets older. He's 14 now. My daughter's 11, and I've told her she can read it when she gets to high school because it's pretty raw, and I want her to make sure she has the emotional capabilities of doing it or understanding it. But I think that what it really helped is me to help them, right? Yes. Because it was such a chaotic time period, and I'm a project manager. I'm an executive. I like things to be in order and have their place. And my entire life was chaos. I mean, quite literally, because my husband's dementia, I mean, he would go around the house and he would take apart things and put pieces everywhere. He would unload file folders, like everything was in chaos. And so for me, it was going back through and learning from the experience. Like, how can I take this really horrific experience and how can I make the most of it in terms of learning from it, sharing it, and then also just becoming okay with it. I mean, if I hadn't written the book, I wouldn't be able to be here with you and talk about this without breaking down in tears, yes. Right? And as part of the process of writing the book, I would have to read my journal entries. I would be bawling. Then I would write, kind of the pieces that I wanted to include in the book, and I'd be bawling. And then I had to sleep on it before I could share it. I was part of a mastermind group where we were sharing our stories and we were supposed to read what we wrote, which is great practice for getting ready to share your story to everyone. Because I'm a pretty private person, believe it or not. And I hadn't shared a lot of the stuff in real time. And so being able to talk about such personal things with other people, it was good to have a safe space to do that in. But if I hadn't gone through the writing, the reading, the sleeping, the crying, and then the reading it again, that just helped my brain kind of process everything so that I could not, I mean, look, there's always emotional baggage and things that you take with you, but it really helped me understand it and to make the most of it and to get a perspective that I think is more healthy.
Yes. And I think of benefit to your kids at that stage. That whole process that you're going through was very helpful in terms of getting you centered to deal with your kids.
Yeah. And I also think it'll be valuable when they get older because I was careful in the book. I wanted to not only show my husband's illness, but also capture who he was, and some of his stories and some of the before, so that it was not just about his illness, but also about him. And so I think that will really help them as they get older because they were 5 and 8 when they last saw their dad. So my son has some memories of him who was 8 at the time. He's 14 now, like I said, but my daughter really doesn't. I mean, she was 5 and most of her memories of him were frankly probably not very favorable. And so it was important for me to capture who Russ was as well. And while the stories and while everything was still fresh.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Beyond the personal narrative of loss, your book sheds light on the devastating impact of Lyme disease. What are the key messages you want readers to take away about Lyme disease, its diagnosis, and its effects?
Yeah, there's a few things. The first thing is that Lyme disease is so much more than most people are aware of. So first of all, a lot of people think, well, you get this bullseye rash, you get a fever, you maybe get some neck pain or something of that sort. But it can be so much more than that. I mean, my husband's symptoms, he never had a rash that we remember. His symptoms were more mood-based. So he was depressed, he was anxious. And then after that, it really became cognitive, where he was forgetting things. And obviously to the point where the official diagnosis was Alzheimer's disease. So it can have really dramatic impacts in symptomology. It can manifest as a cardiac condition, as a joint condition, as a skin condition. I mean, there's so many different ways that it can present that it's difficult to really say, okay, hey, this is Lyme in this little box, right? And then you add on top of that, really, it should be less about Lyme and more about tick-borne diseases, because in addition to Lyme disease, you can have a host of other pathogens that you can get from a tick. So you can have Babesia, you can get Bartonella, you can get Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, then there's all sorts of viruses. And so it's a long list of stuff. I mean, we call ticks nature's dirty needle, right? So there's all sorts of things you can get. And I think the other thing I would want people to know is that what led us astray, because actually when I first realized my husband was sick, one of the first things I thought about was Lyme disease. And that's not typical, right? I was doing research and I saw, I just started Googling brain fog, right? And Lyme disease popped up and it resonated with me because my husband was a hunter. He was always in the woods. He lived in many endemic areas. He had multiple tick exposures. And so I was like, oh, this actually fits. And so the very first doctor that we went to, I had him tested for Lyme and he tested negative. And that sent us on a path where we saw doctor after doctor after doctor looking for answers. And it wasn't until 15 months later, after that first appointment, where I had him retested for Lyme. And then I finally figured out that not only did he have Lyme, but he also had Babesia and Bartonella. And so I think that I would want everybody to know that the current standard of care for Lyme disease testing is about 50% accurate. And there's published studies that show this time and time again. It's 40 to 60% accurate. It's going to misdiagnose enormous numbers of people. And so if you get a negative, that doesn't necessarily mean you should stop digging if you think that that is what's causing your symptoms. And so those are important aspects that I'm still continuing to advocate for and working to improve. And then obviously that's kind of led me to where I am now at Galaxy Diagnostics to provide better tools so that we have something that's more accurate than a coin flip, right? Because that's really unacceptable for such a complex chronic disease.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that, I mean, I don't know the American medical system all that well, but here in Canada, we are facing a shortage of doctors across the land. The highly vaunted Canadian medical system is in a state of disarray. And what we're faced with in that is, if you do get lucky enough to have a family doctor, and there are hundreds of thousands of people that don't, you have 15 minutes to talk about one issue.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how do you persevere given those kind of circumstances?
Yeah. I mean, I think that is really untenable for any form of chronic illness, right? I think it's a system, an American system is similar in that it's really optimized for acute disease. It's in for a quick prescription, a quick fix. If it can't be reset, removed, or dealt with a single prescription, it's not really well taken care of in our system. And I'm sure obviously in yours as well, because 15 minutes is very difficult. And so more and more in the United States, folks are flocking to what's known as functional medicine providers. And these are physicians where they spend significantly more time really diving into your family history. They do extensive diagnostics. They really probe in or dive in to look at what is the root cause of your symptoms and holistically assess all of you and all of your history to try and figure that out. Unfortunately, that's only accessible to people that can pay for it because it's all cash pay. I hope that changes, and I hope that we get to a more equitable health solution in, all countries. But that's one of the ways that I see people getting well, and that's really not acceptable.
No. As a mother, how did you navigate your own grief while also supporting your children through the loss of their father?
Yeah. It was very difficult. I mean, there were many moments, and I talk about this pretty openly in the book, where I would just be hiding in my closet, crying on the floor in the back of my closet. Just the grief was overwhelming and the frustration of dealing with something that I couldn't fix. Again, I'm an engineer, so I like to fix things. And I couldn't fix his illness. I couldn't fix a lot of his mood swings. And then I also couldn't be there for my kids, right? I wanted to go to their birthday parties and I wanted to go to the park. And I increasingly had the demands of being a caregiver to a full-time dementia patient. And so there really isn't a good way to handle that. And I think the way that I handled it, the things that I'm proud of is that I was always open with the kids and I always just tried to talk about it as honestly as I could. And when I couldn't answer a certain question, I would just acknowledge it and just say, hey, let mommy worry about that for now. And right now you focus on being a kid and that's mom's problem. And I will keep you as updated as I can. So that I think helped along the way. I think the thing that I didn't necessarily do well was I didn't really reach out to my network and ask for help. I think there's a tendency, at least for me, and I've heard this from other caregivers as well, is you try and you be the Sherpa where you just throw all the things in the backpack and you try and hunker it up the hill and get it all done. And the burden is just too much. I mean, I was trying to do my full-time job, right? I was still working. I was trying to take over all the responsibilities that Russ had in terms of, he was helping a lot with the kids and the house and just logistics. And I was taking over all that because he was no longer able to do it. And then I had a third job of being his full-time caregiver and trying to arrange his medical care and being his medical proxy and all the things. And it was too much. And I didn't give myself enough grace and I didn't reach out to my network for help because I have fantastic friends and family and I know they would have wanted and definitely helped. But I tried to be the Sherpa and I try and encourage other caregivers in similar situations to really be creative in ways that you can use your support network to get through those difficult times because there is an unrealistic expectation to think that you can do it all on your own.
Yes. And especially sustained over a longer period of time.
Right.
That's perhaps a great short-term solution, but it just won't work out in the long run.
No, it really is something that is, I mean, if you think about my husband, I realized that he was sick in 2016. He didn't pass away until 2022. So this is a multi-year experience that was complicated and draining. And like you said, it's definitely a marathon. It's a long-term thing and you need to plan for it accordingly. Otherwise, you'll end up suffering on your own health. And I met many caregivers once, Russ was in an assisted living facility. I met many caregivers because, I'm fortunate that I'm young, right? Most people in a dementia unit, their spouses are not in their 40s, which I just happened to be. Most of them were in their 60s and 70s. And there were many of them where they had their own issues because of their caregiving demands.
Yes. Yes. I've seen that too. I mean, who's providing the care and who's getting the care. It's often hard to discern that.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. If there's one thing you wish you had known or understood earlier about Lyme disease or about the grieving process, what would it be and why is that important for others to know?
Well, I talked about the testing, right? I think that's a huge piece because I think that's where it leads so many people astray. And I think when you talk to people, even scientific people, I had worked in medical diagnostics, right, before my whole journey with Russ. And so it seems completely untenable that the standard of care test for a large disease state, even if you believe the CDC numbers in the United States, right, it's 500,000 people every year. And I believe the numbers are much higher than that because you have a test that's 50% accurate, but still 500,000 people that are diagnosed every year. And the test that's on the front lines is 50% accurate. And so people don't understand, well, why is that, right? It seems completely crazy and unrealistic because we live in 2025 and we have lots of fantastic technologies with artificial intelligence and things. But the reality is that the test that we're using was still developed decades ago. It was made more as an epidemiological screening tool rather than a diagnostic tool. And the reason that it's so challenging and inaccurate as a diagnostic is because it's looking at antibodies. So Borrelia is a pathogen that is extremely good at evading and suppressing the immune system. As I dove into the literature and the science, I realized that there are dozens of papers that are describing the specific biochemical pathways that Borrelia uses to literally manipulate the immune response. It's actually quite masterful. It's scary and masterful. And then what are we using to measure it? We're using antibodies, which are a measure of immune response. It's like relatively easy to see how the system can break down. And the other thing that's really important to understand is that the most effective period for treatment is the first 30 days. So a delay in treatment, even beyond 30 days, can actually lead to an over 2 times likelihood that a patient develops long-term chronic symptoms. So early diagnosis and treatment is critical, but antibodies take about 4 to 6 weeks to peak. Some people don't ever develop an antibody response, but even those that do, it takes 4 to 6 weeks to develop. And so you're missing that critical therapeutic window and enabling more and more people to descend into treatment failure. And so this is just something that needs to be addressed. I was actually just in Washington on Wednesday doing advocacy for Lyme disease and other tick-borne disease diagnostics to basically drive change in the sector and to get new diagnostics, through the FDA, and just updating congressional leaders on what that looks like and what's in process. And so that's really what needs to happen. But I think 90% of people, 99% of people are just not aware that when they go to their doctor and they get a test, that test could be completely inaccurate because it just goes against logic, right? You go to your doctor to get answers, you get a test, you think it's going to be accurate, but that's just not the case. And it seems difficult to accept, but it's what the science says.
Mm-hmm. What's being done to change that?
Yeah, well, that's what we're working on at Galaxy every day. I mean, in just a little bit of story about how I ended up at Galaxy. I stepped away from my job when I put Russ into his resident care facility. I just said I needed some time off to focus on the family. And on the other side of that, I wrote the book. I started doing advocacy. But, my background, I have degrees in material science and biomedical engineering, and I've spent my entire career in small companies bringing innovative technologies to the market. And the last half of that career has been in medical devices and medical diagnostics. And so when I thought about what is wrong in Lyme disease, right? Like what is the problem that I want to slot into to solve? Diagnostics seemed like the perfect place for me to slot in because one, I had worked in it before. I've brought many products, medical devices through the FDA, and I understand the technology. And two, it was the critical moment where our journey went wrong, right? It was the first thing I thought of when I took Russ to the doctor. It was that first negative test that led us astray, and we wasted 15 months. Now, if I had had a positive test at that initial appointment, would his story be different? Would he be here today? I still don't know that, right? Because he had probably still had the pathogen on board for years, but I would have loved to have the opportunity, right? But I know that by losing those 15 months and his disease getting further and further entrenched, my likelihood of success went down with every day. And so on the other side of kind of, there's no other side of advocacy because I continue to do it to this day. But as I kind of figured out, what do I want to do next? How do I want to slot back in my career? I looked around at what are the diagnostic solutions that are out there? What are the specialty labs doing? What's the standard of care? What are the universities doing? What's in the research? And I really scanned all of the different offerings and things that were up and coming. And I came across this company called Galaxy that was really focused on what I thought was the right question, which is how do we get accurate direct detection, right? Because if you think about COVID, right? We all got a little bit of a crash course in diagnostics in COVID. If you want to know if you have COVID, you don't get an antibody test, right? Like I have antibodies. I've been vaccinated. I've had the disease like 3 times. You don't get an antibody test to tell you if you have an active infection. You get a PCR or an antigen test. But in Lyme disease and in other tick-borne illnesses, those tests don't exist or they're not sensitive enough. You can order one, but it's just never going to return a positive because The reality is these are stealth infections that live below the level of detection of traditional methods. And we need new methods that really improve that limit of detection to get accurate results. And that was the key problem that Galaxy was focused on solving. How do we lower the limits of detection? How do we enrich the samples? How do we get accurate direct detection? And so I just started reading their published papers and understanding what was going on in the technology, and just reached out to the founders and said, hey, I really like what you're doing. I'd like to see if I can help. And once I realized that the technology was real and that there was an opportunity to scale it to a broader audience, that's when I decided to kind of really officially join the company. I became CEO in June of last year. And our mission, we've solidified, is we want to change the standard of care. So, as I was saying earlier, in the United States, treatment and getting well is really reserved to people who can afford it. And that's not okay. So what we want to do is we want to change the standard of care. We want to get FDA approval for our testing solutions. We want to get reimbursements. We want to integrate it into the traditional allopathic medical community and offerings so that everybody can have access to the technology. And so that's what we're working on. We're scaling up. We have a lab where we offer testing services directly to physicians, but we're in the process of taking our Lyme assay, through the FDA and really scaling up what we can do and partnering with key companies, clinical labs, and reagent providers so that we can make it accessible to the masses. And so I'm hopeful, and we're working every day to make sure that better options are available in the future.
That's wonderful news.
It's not an easy path, but
No.
we're committed, and we believe. We've got great testing results already. The test that we offer today is in an acute patient population. It catches the 50% of patients that the standard of care misses, and then in chronic patients, it's really good at discerning, okay, when is the infection still on board, right? Because a lot of people are dealing with, chronic Lyme. And the reality is part of the reason it's been a complicated space is because sometimes people are still sick after Lyme treatment for a few different reasons. They may have persistent Lyme disease because research has shown that standard course of doxycycline doesn't necessarily kill the bacteria. They could have undiagnosed co-infections. So we've been finding, we just in February launched our BBB assay, which is Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia. And we're identifying cases of Babesia, very low level Babesia infections that have been previously undiagnosed. And so they could have a co-infection on board. They could have immune dysregulation caused by either the bacteria or the treatment. They could have mold illness. They could have, all sorts of environmental exposures and toxins. It's really complicated. One of the things that I really came to understand in my husband's journey was that once your immune system gets dysregulated, lots of things can build up. And it's really, chronic illness is like an onion. You kind of have to peel the layers one by one and figure out how to get well. And so having a test that can say, is Lyme causing an issue for you right now, is really key. And so a lot of doctors are using that in their practice to discern whether they should be continuing to treat Lyme in some way or if they need to be treating some of those other factors.
Yes, yes. I often think about HIV and Lyme and the groundswell of support that ended up happening after a period of time with HIV.
Yeah.
And it feels like we need to build a movement like that.
Yeah, and I think it's coming. I think COVID, as crazy as it was, has actually been really good for the Lyme community because it's legitimized the whole concept of an infection-associated chronic illness. This has become a term, at least with our United States government, that's really acknowledging that infections can cause long-term chronic disease. And Lyme has been and Borrelia has been one of the ones that's always on the top of the list and really something that needs to be explored. And so it really legitimized the science that goes behind the pathogen. I think where we still need to make further progress is really understanding the role of these pathogens and other quote unquote diagnosed diseases. And I say in the air quotes because Alzheimer's disease is one where consortium of scientists have gotten together and said there is a key role of pathogens in the development of Alzheimer's disease, not just Borrelia, but other pathogens, other viruses, and other infections. There's some respiratory infections, there's oral pathogens, all sorts of things that could potentially lead to the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And so they've come together and kind of established a consensus protocol that would say, okay, you should be testing for these top pathogens anytime you have an Alzheimer's case where you have kind of a high risk individual. My husband would have been a perfect example. No genetic predisposition, no family history, very young, no comorbidities, ate a Mediterranean diet, all the things you're supposed to do for brain health, yet his brain was systematically destroying itself. And so understanding how many of the 7 million Americans, and I'm not sure how many Canadians, are suffering from Alzheimer's disease, and how many of those could have their condition reversed through the appropriate treatment and resolution of the pathogens they have on board. Mental health is another big one. So there's been a lot of research linking schizophrenia to Bartonella. Bartonella is another vector-borne disease, can be transmitted by fleas. It's very common in household cats. And studies have shown that 65% of schizophrenia patients have Bartonella.
Wow.
Right. And another study, so that study was with NC State and UNC in North Carolina here where I live. And another study with Columbia University showed that you are 3 times more likely to have Bartonella in your blood if you've had a psychotic event. And so there's a link there between mental illness. And there was a paper published last year by Robert Bransfield that looked at a homicide-suicide case, had Borrelia on board that led to elevated levels of a neurotoxic substance, which basically causes psychiatric issues. And it actually causes substance abuse because in this particular case, the drug PCP actually downregulates those receptors. And so this particular boy was going to drugs for relief of the symptoms caused by Borrelia. And so there's linkages to all of this: mental health, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, like really diving in and saying, where are pathogens playing a role? And then understanding the prevalence of these pathogens and how to reverse some of these conditions. But I think part of the reason that hasn't been available is because of the lack of accurate testing, right? So this is kind of back to what we're trying to do at Galaxy is let's get the accurate test, then let's use that as a springboard to really understand infection-associated chronic illness and then get people well.
Yes. Wonderful description of what you're doing. And I think that, I'm so moved by your personal journey and what you've translated that into. There's commitment there that I feel is very important in terms of pressing forward and bringing others along.
No, thank you. I think one of the things I said towards the end of my book is I'm not a huge believer that things happen for a reason. I'm kind of a believer that you have to make your reasons, right? And you have to figure out what you're going to take from any experience. And what happened to my family was devastating. But at the end of the day, if we can help prevent other families from experiencing the same thing, then it'll be a silver lining in the whole journey.
Yes. If I've missed anything, if there was a question that you wish I would have asked, what would it be?
I could talk for days about this topic, but I would say that, as a caregiver, one of the things that I found so confusing was navigating the space, right? So many doctors will tell you it's all in your head, or your lab tests are normal, or Lyme doesn't exist in your region, and it really becomes difficult to understand what the truth is. And so one tool that I would point people towards is actually, before I started working with Galaxy, I did a project for the Center for Lyme Action. And the Center for Lyme Action is an organization in the United States that really lobbies for more federal funding for Lyme disease research. And so I worked with them to develop a paper called The State of Lyme Disease Research. And in this, we really looked at what have been the scientific advancements and what is our scientific understanding. Because at the end of the day, right, science will win. It may take a long time for us to see the light, but we will get there. And so what does the science say? And what is the case for investing more research funds in some of these critical disease states like mental health and Alzheimer's and cardiac issues and so forth? And the paper was written to be accessible by congressional staffers, non-scientific people. And so I think it's a good resource. I wish it was something that I had when I was a caregiver, because it's really difficult to read science. I mean, I'm a scientist and engineer, and even reading scientific papers is difficult for me. And so for people that are not in the industry, it's going to be nearly impossible. This is a resource that people can use to understand where we are. And I've also encouraged people to give it to their doctors. If you have a doctor that is maybe not understanding the latest in Lyme disease research, the understanding of where we are, it's a good tool for that. It really only covers Borrelia. So I think maybe someday we'll do a similar project for co-infections, because as I said, those can be just as devastating, and they don't have to come with Lyme, like Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, Rickettsia. You can get those all individually and they can still be devastating and they can still be misdiagnosed. And so there's more to understand, but I think just awareness of the fact that it should be something on your radar screen is really the first step.
I'm going to ask you to just, if you could contain it to 5 or 6 items that are like links to readings, papers that you feel are very important, and we'll attach them to the show notes.
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that first would be Galaxy's website, right? We have information on testing. We actually will be in the process of relaunching our website soon. So hopefully maybe by the time this comes out, that'll be done. I think the Center for Lyme Action, the State of Lyme Disease Research, definitely include a link to that. And then I think there's a lot of other great organizations like Project Lyme, Lyme Warrior, Bay Area Lyme. There's lots of great resources that people can utilize for various aspects of their journey.
And I'm really thinking about how do we link people into this by providing the information for them that they're not getting through the regular processes of visiting their family doctor. I think a coalescing of the energy is important. Yeah,
I mean, so many advancements in this space have been driven by patients and advocates. And I think that's going to continue until we kind of get enough momentum that it'll take over and cascade through the medical system. And I think we're getting closer, but I encourage people to always demand better of their physicians and of their testing. And if you've got a doctor that's not listening to you, find another doctor. And I know that's not sometimes as easy as it sounds, but one of the things that I've learned is that you really have to advocate for yourself and for your loved ones, because you might not be a medical expert, but you're an expert in you or your loved one, and you know when something's wrong. And if you're not getting the answers that make sense, you got to keep pushing.
Yes. Yeah. Persistence is a necessary skill.
Yes.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much for joining our podcast today. It's been very enlightening to speak with somebody that's actually experienced on a number of different levels, from a number of different angles. So I'm just totally delighted with having spoken to you.
Well, I really appreciate you inviting me on the show and letting me share our story. I think it's a difficult journey to be on. And I think one of the things I guess a parting thought that I would have is sometimes my book, What Lurks in the Woods, is if you're in the middle of your Lyme journey, it might be difficult for you to read because, as I said, my story doesn't end well, but it's a good tool to give it to the people around you. So maybe they can be a little bit more empathetic as to what you're going through and how confusing it is, so that they get it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. That's sound advice, actually, for the concentric circles outside of us. Thank you for listening to this episode of Looking at Lyme. Tune in next time to hear from more experts from Canada and around the world. And remember, don't bring the outdoors indoors. Check for ticks.